Good evening, everyone. My name is Samantha Pujol, and I'm the Director of Football Administration and Events at the Atlantic Coast Conference and a member of CORE. We welcome you to tonight's webinar as we continue our celebration of the 2021 ACC Spring Unity Week. This week's theme is Activism Through Sports.
Good evening. My name is Shoshana Engel-Lewis, and I'm the Associate Vice President for Athletics, Governance, and Inclusion at Georgia Tech. I'm also a member of ACC CORE. A bit of housekeeping before we get started and introduce our guests. There will be an opportunity to submit questions tonight via the chat function in your Zoom control panel. The goal, time permitting, will be to get as many questions in as possible. Again, we welcome and thank you for joining us for tonight's session, the Call to Activism, a discussion with Lonita Baker and Dallin Cuff. Ms. Baker is a personal injury attorney in Louisville, Kentucky, with vast experience, including time at the Jefferson County Attorney's Office and the Louisville Metro Public Defender Corporation. Part of the ACC family, Ms. Baker holds 3 degrees, a BA, JD, and MBA from the University of Louisville. Ms. Baker's service to both the legal and Louisville communities has been recognized with numerous awards, including being named a top 40 under 40 attorney and 3 presidential awards from the National Bar Association, the 2019 Justice Award from the Louisville Urban League, and a 2020 nod as a top 40 under 40 by Louisville Business First, among many others. In 2020, Ms. Baker gained national attention with her representation of the family of Breonna Taylor. Ms. Baker's work resulted in a groundbreaking settlement with the city of Louisville, including terms of police reform, in addition to one of the largest ever financial awards for an individual civil rights case. She continues to advocate for justice and reform in Louisville, the state of Kentucky, and nationally. On behalf of the ACC and its continued commitment to social justice and racial equality, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Lonita Baker.
And now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to former basketball player turned ESPN and ACC network broadcaster, Dallin Cuff.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Shoshana. Thank you for the conference. Happy to be here and be chatting with Lonita. I think this is going to hopefully be a very interesting and enlightening conversation. And as they mentioned, if you want to submit some questions, please do so. We'll get to those a little later. But excited to start the conversation around. We'll get to activism and that call to activism for you and engaging others as to be involved in this struggle to find some progress as it relates to social justice and racial equality in our society, in our country. But I do want to start with the Derrick Showman verdict yesterday and the reaction to the man that obviously murdered George Floyd has now been convicted of that crime on all 3 charges. Your experience with Breonna Taylor. You won the civil case. Obviously, the criminal case was never brought to charges, which many of us that followed that were disheartened and upset about, and I'm sure you were as well. But this verdict was something that I think everybody hoped for in terms of showing accountability. What was your reaction to the verdict yesterday?
Yeah, I was definitely excited to see that the jury in Derrick Chauvin's criminal trial found him guilty and of all 3 charges. Being that was a situation that could happen in Minnesota. I didn't know that until yesterday. I kept thinking, oh, he has to be found guilty of one of the 3, but then learning a little bit more about Minnesota law, learned that he could be convicted of all 3. And so that the jury did that, I was really inspired. But I also recognized that was a case, like what we received yesterday at this point was justice for George Floyd. So his family got some semblance of justice. Only time will tell if April 20th, 2021 is a turning point in American history and the way that our justice system works. I think it's too early to say that this is indicative of what's happening. I think we got justice in one case. Many people asked yesterday how Tamika Palmer felt about the verdict. That's Breonna Taylor's mom, and she's definitely happy for George Floyd's family. She had a conversation with them yesterday. She congratulated them. They cried together, but at the same time, she's still searching for justice in the criminal justice system for Breonna Taylor, as we await the federal investigation to see what federal authorities may do in the case.
On that note, what would you say to folks too? Because I think obviously yesterday was important. We'll see, as you noted, will that be a turning point? Will it be a date that we kind of remember that there is accountability even for police officers in these situations where you have to atone for these awful situations that you create as officers of the law at times. But that is just one case, as you mentioned. What's the balance between people understanding that, celebrating that in some regard, but also realizing there's been literally thousands and thousands of cases unsolved or not tried or anything of that like compared to what we are. This is just one case where it's not justice necessarily, it's accountability, but
Right.
the term justice is just for one case.
Right. And I think that we have to be careful and always be cognizant of that. I think one instance and one example that I would give is, we heard about the 16-year-old girl, Micaiah Bryant, I think in Columbus. And, I had made a post about, well, I can't celebrate the verdict in Derrick Chauvin's case without then turning around and having to actually process that a 16-year-old girl was killed in Columbus by police. And at that time, I think it was put out that she had called the police because people were trying to jump her. Video came out. Of course, she has a knife. And even in my statement, I never cast judgment on the police officers in that case, but it was still, I have to process this. And I think so many people were so quick once that video came out, was like, well, she was wielding a knife and she would have killed the other person. And recognizing that this is something that as a Black woman, a Black woman with a 25-year-old daughter, I still have to process the potential, so still recognizing that people still have to process it, that there are still professional Black men, and not that their professions matter, but I was talking to another attorney, intellectual property attorney earlier today, and just the little things he was talking about. He was traveling back from Florida to New York, but while in Florida, he had driven from Orlando to Jacksonville to visit his family. He was flying back out of Orlando, and he was going to initially fly out on a 6 a.m. flight. Well, then the more he thought about it, he said, no, I'm not going to fly out at 6 a.m. because then that puts me on the road at least 4 a.m. I don't want to risk being pulled over. And so for people to process that this is really something that Black Americans go through, and whether we believe, officers are justified or not justified, it's still, so like it is the age old of, she had a knife, but how many white mass murderers have we seen taken in without incident, and they're carrying automatic rifles?
Yeah.
So we have to think broader than whether or not an officer is justified, and just in how are we policing, and why does there appear to be a different way that we police Black communities versus white communities. And that's what we have to get to the heart of. It's not always that every officer has to be convicted, but we really do have to get at changing the way that policing is done in America.
100% agree. And on that, I asked that question because as important as yesterday may be, there's still so much work to be done. So that's kind of what I want to make sure folks understand as we talk about the call to activism. In reading your site, I thought this was really interesting. You said 2020 was the year God chose to amplify my voice, and I earned clarity in God's purpose for my life. Can you expound on that and what that meant for you to represent Breonna Taylor's family, and how that's informed your purpose in your life?
Yeah. So I've utilized charted my legal career following the advice of Charles Hamilton Houston, who was once Dean of Howard Law School, a mentor to, the late Justice Thurgood Marshall and other civil rights attorneys of that time. And he had a famous quote that said, a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. And so for me, in my legal career, I've always wanted to make sure that I'm using my experience and my education to be a social engineer, to change the way that our justice system works. So, as you heard in my bio, I started my legal career as a public defender, wanting to represent the individuals who were kind of shunned by society, left on the outskirts, those who could not afford legal counsel but are charged with criminal offenses, whether it ranged from, traffic offenses, minor traffic offenses, up to murder. Like I had cases that ran the gamut. the thing that I recognized in that position was I only had so much power to change anything. It was really each case for itself, but I didn't have the power to change the way that the criminal justice system operated. It was kind of, if my client was guilty, I was working at the mercy of the prosecutor. So then I wanted to switch sides. I became a prosecutor, and I used my role as a prosecutor to change the way, and even change the way that my coworkers in my office operated, in not prosecuting cases to punish people, but what services can we provide individuals? Because so much of the criminal justice system, and anyone that's worked any iota of time in the criminal justice system will tell you, the large majority of cases or of individuals there are there because of mental illness, because of a drug addiction, or because of a combined mental illness and drug addiction. We don't have enough resources for mental illness. We don't have enough resources for drug addiction. And especially those resources become even more limited when you're talking about people without resources to pay for treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And so my goal was always to, what services can I provide individuals, whether it be mental health treatment, whether it be, drug addiction treatment, so that they don't continue to come back into my courtroom. Like, I don't want to see you anymore,
Yeah.
And sometimes it was just getting people jobs. Some people are just poor, and it spirals into a circle of depression. And so it's like, okay, so can we have some list of employers who hire people with criminal backgrounds? And so that was the way that I prosecuted, just to really try to stop the cycle of recidivism. Eventually I left there, became a civil attorney, ended up getting civil rights cases. And while I've had civil rights cases prior to Breonna Taylor, they would get attention on the local media. So when I say that 2020 amplified my voice, I was practicing here in Louisville, Kentucky. People around the world may not have known me unless it was through, my participation in the bar organization, traveling to conferences, things like that. But the world did not know or did not get to hear Lonita Baker's voice. And when I say God's purpose for me, is because one day I was out at a protest here in Louisville, and one of the protesters came up and said, the mayor was just here, and he was talking about why he could not fire the officers. But I listened to you on the news, and I heard you say why he could fire them, and you said the statute that he could use to fire them. And I told the mayor, like, yes, you can, and here's why. And so I realized at that moment, like, oh, people are really listening to me and what I say. Mm-hmm. And so I knew I had to turn it into a moment of education. So if I was going to use my voice, not just to get out there and say, whatever, to get people onto my side, but to really educate people on the process, how the criminal justice system works, how people's role, like the role that we as individual citizens play in electing prosecutors. So, I always say the difference between Derrick Chauvin and the officers that killed Breonna Taylor is that Minnesota had an attorney general who was courageous enough to indict the officers, to present and the grand jury does the indictment, but to even present charges to a grand jury to get an indictment. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Kentucky, our attorney general refused to even present charges to a grand jury. So that's the difference. But we elect those people. Yeah. So we have a voice in that process by deciding not to reelect prosecutors who aren't going to be courageous enough to let the criminal justice system play out the same way for police officers who commit crimes as it does for everyday citizens.
You touched on a couple of things there that I do want to come back to. Reforming an institution from within, as you talked about, trying to becoming a prosecutor and trying to change the way those things operate. Obviously, an elected official wielding what should be a criminal decision, but with political influences. I think there's some questions around that. But I'd like to ask, just in terms of, as we're talking about call to activism, you said something to me off before we started that I thought was really interesting. Would you call yourself an activist?
I don't consider myself an activist. I consider myself an attorney who tries to give activists the tools to do what they do. I always say, like, activists can be much more vocal and brave than I can be as an attorney, because, you know, even as an attorney, I'm always limited in making sure I don't say anything that might harm my client's case, or and really it's my client's case. At the end of the day, that's my obligation and ethical responsibility is to my client. So I always have to put them first above anything. So activists get to go out and fight for the community. But if the community and my clients at odds, I'm like, screw the community. Not really, but in the back, on the public, like on the back end, I was like, hey, here's how we can both get to where we need to go. But I do think that when I said I fashioned my legal career to be a social engineer, one could say that to be a social engineer, you have to be an activist too.
Yeah, I think you may not define yourself an activist, but me sitting here, I do. So I think that's why you are sitting in that chair. You may not see it necessarily like in that terms, but I think those of us listening to you and listening to your path and who you're trying to represent understand that, you know, intimately. In terms of trying to reform, as you're trying to be, how difficult is that? Or how, in terms of reforms, we always talk about trying to create change. And it seems like we're always pushing against systems from external forces and trying to force change upon a system. Within the criminal justice system, which I think people across the political spectrum, which is why this is an issue, believe there needs to be reform. You're within it trying to reform things and do things differently. Prosecutors hold a boatload of power. I don't think people really understand sometimes don't think about, like, the prosecutors are the ones calling the shots a lot of times. So how would you think we go about, and how would you advise activists that want criminal justice reform to go about creating change externally, and those that are in the system, how do you create change internally?
Yeah. So for activists or people, you know, on the outside, I think at the end of the day, the most important piece of advice I can give is to make sure you are paying attention to prosecutorial races, judicial races. There's so many times, like on election day, I'm getting text messages from people like, oh, what judge, like, I didn't know judges were on the ballot. What judges do I need to vote for? Or what prosecutor? Like, they just don't know. Like, we're so caught up in, oh, it's a presidential race, or, oh, we're voting for the mayor. And it's like, at least in Louisville, Kentucky, when we're voting for a mayor, we're also voting for a prosecutor. So are you paying it close enough to that attention, or are you surprised when you get to the ballot box that this is even on the ballot, and then you pick the name that stands out most to you? But we really have to do a little bit more research. And I say for attorneys, it's our job to inform people before they get to the voting box of, here's who, you know, here's what this judge stands for. Here's a pattern of behavior from this judge that public needs to know about. And same with prosecutors, you know them as attorneys before they're running for prosecutors. So it really is on attorneys to use their positions more more purposefully to inform the greater public when we have those elections, so that we make sure that people are getting into those positions. So when you have and knowing that when you're in Baltimore, Maryland, and you have a state attorney like Marilyn Mosby, that she is brave enough to prosecute police officers when necessary. And when I say prosecute, again, my position is let the jury do what it's supposed to do. Treat them just like any other person. Like, should we have to have a video of a man being with a knee on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds to get to prosecute officers? Because let's face it, it was hard not to prosecute Derrick Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. Like, what else do you need? But when we talk about regular citizens being charged with murder and tried, you don't need to smoke a gun. You don't need the video to get a normal everyday citizen indicted, right? So if there's enough other evidence out there, why do we always have to rely on body count video? And at this point, we've seen so many instances where police officers have lied. And when you get video, you're like, well, that's surely not what happened. So I think it's irresponsible for prosecutors to say, oh, we relied on the word of the officer. Like, you really just have to look at the evidence at this point. And that's what we should be doing. And I think we need prosecutors who are courageous enough. Your Keith Ellison's out of Minnesota. And not only was Keith Ellison courageous enough to indict the officers responsible for George Floyd's murder, but he also brought in outside counsel who had the resources and the time and the talent to skillfully prosecute those officers. So other prosecutors can do the same thing. Like, so the takeaway that's one of the takeaways from yesterday that I walked away with was Keith Ellison did it the way it wasn't about him. It wasn't about being able to get his attorney or himself on TV. It's like, no, that was Jerry Blackwell and Steve I'll butcher Steve's last name, but I think it's Sliker. Like, that was their show.
Mm-hmm.
And they did it masterfully. They investigated the way they needed to. They invested in the expert witnesses. And that's how we should see these cases play out. And so for outsiders, vote. For those within the system, be courageous enough to do what's right.
I know you did quite a bit of voter registration before last election and really getting out there and trying to make sure people understood the importance of voting. And we don't need a history lesson. I don't understand why we've tangled up judges in voting. I don't understand why that works out like that, but I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole. I'll do my own research. I do want to ask you, as you're trying to get more folks, as you're out there talking to people, and particularly post Breonna Taylor situation, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and this groundswell and awakening I think a lot of white America had last year. By and large, Black and brown people, this has been going on and discussed for many years, decades, centuries, about what these issues are. But more people are coming forward and wanting to be activated and engaged as of late. How do you help those, or what was your advice? How would you say folks get activated and get more involved? How do people make that step from being concerned to actually engaged?
Yeah, I think one thing we have to do is one thing I talk about is with Breonna Taylor's case, there were so many links or numbers that you could call, and it would call all of the legislators or the Metro Council people. But because I have friends in those places, they would come like, I got 100 calls today and only 10 were from Louisville. So while I like that appears to put pressure on our elected leaders, it doesn't when the elected leaders know that those calls are not coming from their own constituents. So I think, it all boils down to politics. As much as I hate that it boils down to politics, it does. And I guess that's life in general. We're talking to the ACC and the conference, and there's politics within the conference, right? Mm-hmm. So, but in this criminal justice system world, it all boils down to the politics of it all. So making sure that people know, your legislators know how you feel and calling. You don't care what political party they belong to, but this is an issue that matters greatly to me. Call in and know that if you don't change your position on, like in Kentucky, after all of the protests, what our legislators saw fit to spend a significant amount of time on during the General Assembly was a bill that made it a crime to insult a police officer. And I'm like, everything going on and you want to make it a crime to insult a police officer, which is one, asinine, but two, unconstitutional. So you want to pass something that we're going to end up in court on, and spend money fighting through, to appeal. And so it's like, why? So to me, everyone in Frankfurt was useless. That didn't pass, thank God. But the fact that they even talked about it for the 3 months that they were there, they don't deserve to go back to Frankfurt. If they're not going to really take issues that matter seriously, and if they can't quit playing the politics, like, let's replace them and get people who will change legislation, create legislation that makes, that limits qualified immunity, create legislation that changes the mental state required for officers on a federal level. It's like, I think it's reasonable officer, but like to make it necessary, like that you use deadly force when it's absolutely necessary, but not that you have this discretion. Like, oh, I can either use my taser or my gun, so I'm going to use my gun. Like you can only use deadly force when it's necessary. But there's so many laws that need to be changed, banning no-knock warrants, requiring judges to do more than just a brief cursory, because that's one thing that came from Breonna Taylor's case is, a judge signed off on a warrant that contained lies by the officer. And I'm not saying that the judge could have done anything differently to know that that officer lied, but why is it that judges feel so freely to come to you to get search warrants? Like do a self-assessment and say, why do they always come to me? Why don't they go to the judge next door?
Yep.
But so we really do have to hold our elected leaders accountable, and that's something everyone can do.
If some of those listening out there, you mentioned, being in Louisville or being people from Kentucky, what can put the pressure on. I mean, all politics is local. It's a cliche for a reason. So with all these different people we have listening right now from all these different towns and different states, if it is police reform, criminal justice, or anything else, I should say, with police reform and criminal justice in your particular area of expertise, how would they go about trying to drive change they think is necessary? You mentioned no-knock warrants, other things that they think need to be weeded out in their communities. How do you go about identifying those and then trying to get involved to try to put pressure for change?
I think it's one, looking at some of the instances that are taking place in your communities. Is it that no-knock warrants are being executed on, of the no-knock warrants that are being executed or sought by police officers, are 80% of them sought against African Americans, despite African Americans being only 20% of the population? That's a huge issue, right? So start looking and really. I always say the best place to go in for the ACC network, there are universities, because you have professors, especially criminologists, that are studying these things. So figure out where are the major issues within your criminal justice system and start to make changes. No-knock warrants generally, and the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which is pending in Washington, D.C. right now for federal legislation, it will ban no-knock warrants. It will limit qualified immunity, but those are for federal agencies. So you're right when you say all politics are local. We really have to start honing in on those local politicians, ranging from both city level to state level. So in here, we passed the Breonna Taylor's laws in the city, which completely ban no-knock warrants. They're inherently dangerous. You can Google no-knock warrants. You see pictures of a 2-year-old who has been significantly disfigured in the face because police officers went in without a warrant through a flashbang into her playpen. And it's just, what is so important that you have to just ram in a door, and before anyone thinks like, well, what if someone's being held captive, or if there's a risk of someone being murdered? You don't even need warrants for that. So when we talk about no-knock warrants, we're talking about, usually they are sought simply to apprehend drugs. No amount of getting drugs is worth the risk to both police officers and civilians in a no-knock warrant. So we just don't need them. They have no place in law enforcement. Anything that you might think, any exemption that you might think, the law already allows officers to go in without a warrant to begin with. So there's no need to get a no-knock search warrant signed off by a judge. Immunity, we still need at state level. So where we know at this point, again, I go back to Louisville because this is where I'm at. There's been so many problems with Louisville Metro Police Department. Guess what? We still have to sue the individual officers in their official capacity, which puts the city on the hook for the settlement or jury verdict. But you can never you can't sue the police department because of sovereign immunity. Well, if the police department keeps messing up, why can't someone sue them to force them to change? Right? So it's just different statutes, and it's really just figuring out. And people are, so I guess the sovereign immunity is not a thing everywhere, because I always get the people like, oh, you can't sue the city. I'm like, no, we can't sue the city. We can't sue the department. We have to go after the individuals, but the city's still responsible for the payout. But no.
So find a way to learn your local.
Learn it. I say local ACLUs are good places to store it. If there's a NAACP Legal Defense Fund, legal aid, usually the ACLU is great because they do a lot of policy work in different areas, and that's what they're known for doing.
A lot of folks, as we mentioned, have gotten concerned and to engage, and some have become activated in the struggle for social justice. But within that, there's going to be setbacks. There's going to be disappointments. There's going to be frustrations. Obviously, you personally suffered one along with the Breonna Taylor's family when there were no criminal charges brought in the case. How do you overcome those? How do you continue to push forward when there seems like an insurmountable, force pushing against you?
Yeah, I keep telling myself I don't have the right to stop, especially working alongside Tamika Palmer, Breonna's mom, because if she's still willing to push along, who am I to say, you know what, I'm tired. Like, and just to know that ultimately, if all of us unite and continue to fight, we will get to where we need to go. And the sooner we unite, and the sooner, we got to keep the objective, focused on the objective, which is to change, ultimately to change the way we police in America, right? Like that policing doesn't look different in Black and brown communities as it does in white communities. And so how do we get there? And you have to admit that there is a difference, right? You have to admit that there's a difference when Kyle Rittenhouse can murder 2 people, walk right past officers with a gun, when, God forbid, an African-American male walk past officers with a gun, they're going to be stopped for suspicion of something, even if it's just to question them.
Yep.
Like, it just doesn't happen. Like, that is an issue. When we have Black motorists being targeted, and we saw in Virginia the Army lieutenant who did what many Black Americans are trained to do: turn on my flashers, like I'm being pulled over, let me turn on my flashers, get to a well-lit area. And he gets to the gas station and the officers are going ballistic, like, get out. He's like, what did I do? Hands out, like showing them, like, and he's asking, what did I do? And, some people would look at like, well, if he had just gotten out of the car, maybe he wouldn't have gotten pepper sprayed. I looked at that and said, I would have kept my hands out of the window just like he did, because to me, the way that the officer was reacting, if he had reached into his car to unhook his seatbelt, they would have said, oh, I thought he was reaching for a gun and I feared for my life. Like, so I understood that. So it's putting yourself in those shoes and really, like, yes, that lieutenant made it home, but to think of the fear that ran through him, like, as a man, just that fear, really putting yourselves in that position and recognizing that we have to change that. And until we get to a day where that lieutenant was okay to drive, like, turn his hazard lights off, get to the gas station, pull over, and treat it like a human, we haven't gotten anywhere near where we need to be.
Yeah, that's it's well said, because that's like the first part of solving any problem is acknowledging there's a problem. And we're still fighting with a large portion of our population that doesn't think this is police reform's an issue, or police brutality is an issue, or how the communities of color versus white communities are policed differently. As it relates to your kind of journey to become an activist, as you were kind of going through it, and obviously you're an attorney, and you've got 3 degrees from Louisville, very accomplished, and you have a plethora of options, but you chose this path. We probably have some young folks listening that are young and accomplished and thinking about how they want to take their lives and where they want to go. What would be your advice to them to lead them to a place that could create some change, or if it is professionally, they choose one thing but try to be actively engaged as kind of what they do away from their quote unquote job. Like, what would you say to young folks that are trying to kind of figure this thing out?
I think the first thing is one, recognizing that everyone has a role to play in change. Everyone's not going to be the lawyer. Everyone's not going to be the activist that you see boots on the ground protesting every day, but everyone has a role. And even if it's just talking to the people who are around you, because one thing I always used to hate, and especially as I was working as a prosecutor, were when I would get but you're different. And I'm like, but no, I'm not, right? And so when you're in those situations, don't let people get away with saying, well, you're different, or you're safe, or, nothing's going to happen to you, because you know that you don't necessarily have to be doing anything wrong to be in a similar situation as George Floyd, as Lieutenant, I forget, I think it's Navarro, but the lieutenant that was pulled over. Like, you don't have to be doing anything wrong, or it can be as minor as a traffic ticket. Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor in her home asleep.
Yeah.
You just don't know. So don't let people get by with saying you're different, this doesn't happen to you. Don't let people get away with saying, well, if they just comply. Like, we've seen instances where people have complied and they still end up dead, beaten, whatever, in a jail cell. Like, no. We see way too many people now whose convictions are being overturned, through the Innocence Projects. So how many more people are incarcerated under wrongful convictions, or as a result of over policing? And so speaking out on those things to the people who consider themselves your friends, because sometimes it's just, if we don't speak up, they really think that this isn't happening around us, or that we're not impacted by it. And but we are. I could easily detach myself from all of this and like, nope, I'm just going to go be a lawyer. But what happens the day that I get pulled over and treated like a second-class citizen? What happens to the day my daughter might be in the wrong place at the wrong time? Like, I'm going to need people. So just speak up.
Which a lot of, I've been encouraged through this last year, as young people in particular, and college athletes and young people period, have really started to be on the forefront. We saw a lot of our ACC athletes leading protests, leading discussions, and wanting to talk with their teammates and help teammates understand the issues that are going on. In terms of how you communicate, whether that be social media and in person, how important is rhetoric in how you approach communication to try to engage, to bring more people on board? Because it does take way more than the people that are involved. It's going to take, as you mentioned, everybody's going to do their part. So how does your approach to communication, how do you manage that?
I think the very first thing is to definitely be educated. Do more research yourself. Like, there's so much stuff out on the web or social media that could be factually incorrect. So make sure you do a little bit more research and are educated on the things that you're talking about, as opposed to, you use the word rhetoric, but and sometimes we get that, but just make sure you have a little bit more insight. And it's not hard to get that insight. But in communicating, I think definitely we don't have to be confrontational when we're having these conversations, right? I think I go by you kill more bees with honey. So, just being and having a one-on-one conversation with people, but knowing the talking points. And again, with students, professors, criminologists, political scientists, they have the information that you need, like, be able to parse through it. And I'm not saying you have to go get a degree in any of these things or be indoctrinated, but it's just making sure you're not running away with misinformation from memes at times or things like that, because I think you have to. And I think that's one thing of a lot of the feedback that I've gotten over the past year is that people know that, like, oh, like, she's really saying facts. She's not trying to get us emotionally. Like, she's giving us factual information. And so some people who would normally distance themselves away from this fight got involved in the fight, because of me being factual as opposed to sensationalist, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it is. I think it's just having the one-on-one, the not making it a, and for our non-minority accomplices, as I like to call them now, not just allies, but accomplices, because that means you got to be right by me doing the same work. Ally means you're a friend of me, but I need you to work with me. One thing I always say is, sometimes if I speak up, it's going to be that I've become the angry Black woman. But if you say the exact same thing to someone, like if you see if you see someone, say one of those microaggressions, oh, you're not, you're safe. Like, my accomplice needs to speak up for me so that I don't become the angry Black woman when I say, no, I'm not,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's touch on that one more time. We're getting some questions, and we'll get to them. This will be the last question I ask, and then I'll continue to go through some of the ones that the folks have asked. But keep sending those in if you have questions for Lonita. Just on allyship, or as you said, accomplishship, if you will, being an accomplice. I like that term. I think I'm going to steal that from you. Outside of speaking up for you at times and for us at times to try to give a different perspective, what else? How else would you advise accomplices to get involved, and what can they do, and how would you advise folks to get in the mix and become more active? Same thing, but it may be a different perspective coming from a white person.
Yeah, I think one, make sure that when you're giving talking points or when you're saying things, again, the education factor, but also talk to people like me or people who are just like, get a true perspective from, like, don't just jump in the fight. Get a true perspective from a Black or brown person who's been in this world and truly understands it from a personal perspective, not just oh, I've read about this, so I know about it. Like, no, talk to me so you can get a real world perspective on it. But two, just be active. Again, the political process, like, it may not impact you as much, but definitely the political processes, and electing leaders who are going to really fight for everyone. And sometimes that may mean that your tax benefits may not be as great, if not. And I say that not saying to vote one way or the other, even if you want to, and especially accomplices that are in power, right? They have connections. So you probably have the luxury of calling your congressperson and saying, hey, congressman, congresswoman, will you please vote for the George Floyd Justice and Police Act? And here's why, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have to hear from you. You're a person in power. You may be a donor to them. Right?
Yeah,
They listen
this
to
is
you.
true. This is very true.
So you really have to recognize the power that you have. And I think that one thing, student athletes in general, have a lot of power because there's a lot of money in athletics.
Mm-hmm.
And so really use the power that you have in the most efficient way, but also while protecting your space so that you can stay there. But I do want you to recognize the power that you have within. So as a student athlete, you may be a professional athlete, recognize that you have power. You may not be the owner of your team, but you have power, if that makes sense. I was watching, and maybe it was by happenstance, because normally when I'm working from home, I have the news playing all day, but something like turn it on to the movie channels. And The Express came on, and I had already seen the movie Express. For those who don't know, it's about Ernest Davis, who was a halfback for ACC school, Syracuse, was the first African-American Heisman Trophy winner. And recognizing that it's theatrical, so there was probably some, variations, but, when they were playing in the Cotton Bowl and, coach gave this halftime speech about, whether, if we lose this game or we win this game, we can't, like, if we win the game, it means nothing if we let them take the story or change the narrative or make it about fighting on the field or whatever. And this is after he had told Ernie Davis that, I'm going to sit you for the rest of the game. And it was when Ernie Davis, like, he stayed in the locker room. Jim Brown came back, talked to him, like, oh, like how, Texas start coming back. And at this time, Syracuse was one of the few teams that was integrated at that time. And so when Ernie Davis came back out, he does the, am I invisible to you? Like, you tell me these things and you say, this is what we're doing. He's like, but the 3 Black players on this team, we have to sleep in a closet. We can't get on the elevator, like, but we're busting our butts out here playing. And so it took him speaking up. And sometimes it is to your coach, as respectfully as you can, to say, look at me, I am a person and not an athlete. And so I say that, I guess that was a long way of going about saying, although you may be an athlete, you are a person first. And if you are an athlete of color, you are a person of color first. And although something may not personally be related to you, George Floyd has no personal ties to you, but as a person of color, that's something that you have to process and deal with and contemplate. And you have to remind people, hey, this impacts me. I think people need to know that this may be 5 states away, but it still impacts me,
100%, yeah, definitely. That's really true. I think that people don't understand that you may not be personally involved, but it could have a personal impact on you today, tomorrow, down the road. Anybody all these things are connected a lot of times. Yeah. I think somebody asked a really interesting question here, kind of like, we've seen student athletes really start to recognize their power over in recent years, and player empowerment has trickled into college sports. But this is a really interesting question. An anonymous attendee said, you mentioned not wanting to harm your client's case through your own activism. What advice do you have for a student athlete who wants to be an activist, but doesn't want to harm their own future earnings potential as it relates to endorsements and sponsorships?
I would say right now, activism, and again, it may be a trend, but activism is a thing that it's the end thing. So I don't think that it harms future endorsements. You see people like LeBron James speaking out. The WNBA wore jerseys this season that said Breonna Taylor. So we are seeing that in sports. NFL teams were able to choose the name between 5 different families of if they wanted one on their helmet. I think we saw the backlash against the NFL and the way that they blacklisted Colin Kaepernick. I don't think that's the way that where we are now. And I don't know what league, the person is in, but I think activism, I apply, like I call myself a Zennial because I guess I'm between X and millennials. I do think, the millennial generation, like I always say, like I admire their bravery. Like I take my legal profession. The legal profession's one of the stiffest professions. You gotta wear suits, you gotta do this, wear your hair back, You gotta work till midnight every night and be back in here by 4 a.m. Like that's an exaggeration, but it is.
Yeah.
And like the millennials have come in and was like, I'm not billing 2,000 hours a month. I'm not wearing that. I'm doing this. And you're like, and guess what? Law firms have had to change and adapt to accepting the way the millennials are doing stuff. So I'm like, so we're reaping a lot of the benefits of the bravery of that generation, and they're coming into their own. So I am inspired by the millennial generation, the generation of, college students now, and those behind them. And I do really think that we're going to get to the solution. Like they're going to fix the world. everything we haven't been able to do or generations ahead of them have not been able to do. So be brave. And I think only you will know when your bravery becomes detrimental to you. So you always have to be cognizant of what's going on.
Mhm.
So be brave, speak up, be that activist. Kenny Stills was arrested here in Louisville, Kentucky.
Yeah.
It didn't hurt him one way or the other with Houston, Texas. He was back on the field at that time,
Mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah. I think it's interesting just in terms of you said it's kind of in right now. It's a thing, like to be an activist is in. There's always going to be, there could be some brands and whether it's locally that don't want to be on the side of somebody that's an activist. But you're right, that equation has changed. And I think that's for the better. That as corporate America realizes that the empowering people that have a voice and have a platform that are athletes talk and drive change and connect with folks in a different way, hopefully will bring about change.
And I think it's because of people like LeBron James, because I mean, what's Nike gonna do? Like LeBron James say, I'm leaving if you don't let me, wear my hood. And they're like, no, LeBron, you can't leave, right?
Yep. Yeah, 100%.
So I do think that those top athletes are we need more of them to set the path, and I think more of them are doing so. I mean, and then you have people like Dwayne Wade, who's created his own brand over there. So there's always some place for you. I go back to at the beginning of the protest, one of the general counsel, vice president general counsel for UPS is here in Louisville, Kentucky, and he said, and he's very vocal on Instagram, and you just like, again, in attorney world, that's like, oh my God, is he scared they're going to terminate him? And what he said is, and he said, people have asked, like, am I afraid that UPS will get rid of me? He's like, if UPS didn't support me, I would have turned in my letter of resignation yesterday, because I'm not going to be somewhere that doesn't accept me for who I am and doesn't understand what I'm facing as a Black man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So at some point you have to figure out, where am I, because if you stifle your voice, you're not going to be happy. And that's the one thing I always tell people. I talk to law students a lot, and I say, you have to be happy in this world. Like, life's too short for you to not be happy in the career choice that you make. Mm-hmm. And, if you want to be able to speak out and use your voice for good, and wherever you are says, we don't need you doing that, we need you to, behave or whatever, you're not going to be happy there.
No, definitely not. And I think that the stifling of voices has been kind of the norm for years and years and years. And hopefully that'll be somewhat of a change here, that you don't have to stifle your voice. You can articulate your problems. You can have these discussions. You can be active in the struggle here that we always talk about. In terms of the athletes, like you mentioned, LeBron James helped changing the dynamic, kind of a renaissance, really. I mean, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, you mentioned Jim Brown earlier, talking about Early Davis, Muhammad Ali, that generation, Arthur Ashe, they were ahead of their time doing that, trying to drive for change in that civil rights movement. We have athletes doing that now. A question that came in that I think is really interesting: what are the biggest mistakes you see athletes make in participating in activism?
I think, again, the same thing that I say, some people see a meme or one Facebook post and take that as info without digging a little bit deeper. And so sometimes they'll say something that's factually inaccurate, and then they get hounded because they weren't factually accurate. But otherwise, I'm never gonna knock someone that's using their platform for good. But I always like Shaquille O'Neal, who's a former athlete, and I probably shouldn't have said his name, but he made a comment early on about Breonna Taylor, and I'm like, it was completely wrong. And I'm like, why would he say that? And I had, he's with Papa John's, and I have a friend from high school that worked for Papa John's at the time, and I texted her, and I'm like, Shaq said this, and it's incorrect, like, and he was getting hounded for it as well. Mm-hmm. She set up a phone call between me and Shaquille O'Neal, and he was very apologetic for misstating the facts, but he also continue, like he asked me, well, what is it? And and then he went back and corrected himself. So it was just one of those things where he took something that he saw and ran with it, as opposed to I guess he didn't know he had the connections to come straight to the source and say,
Yeah.
okay. And I do think, especially when we're talking about high profile cases, the thing I want us to, I don't want to leave without talking about is we shouldn't wait until there's another high profile case.
Mhm.
Like, we got to continue the fight, even when we don't know of any new, victims or any new instances of police. Like, we got to continue the fight throughout, because we can't let it be a trend. Or, we keep saying this isn't a moment, it's a movement. Well, a movement lasts for years, and
Mhm.
it's continuous. So we got to make sure that we don't make this a trend, but we really make this a way of life, the politics, because it's politics. So we always have elections, and
Yeah,
politicians should always be on their feet about, I might lose my election if I don't do this right. So
Yeah.
that's why I say it's continuous. We don't need to wait. Like in Louisville, we haven't had, it's been a while since we've had anyone killed by police, but we need to continue the conversation so that there's not anyone killed by police. And although we haven't had anyone killed, we did have a protester who was caught on camera beaten by police. Like, what? So you got to raise just as much hell with the powers that be here. Like, do we expect that to be a national case? No, but we can raise hell right here locally, right? So
yeah. I kind of touched on this with you earlier, where we're coming to the end of our time, but I want to have a chance for you to kind of
flies.
It really does. This has gone by quick. It's 7:57. So want to get this question. We touched on it. You mentioned Miss Palmer Breonna Taylor's mother continues to inspire you, given what she's gone through. If she's fighting every day, you can fight every day too. But one of the questions came from Renee Miles Payne, wondering who else inspires you to do this work and go through this and keep battling every day?
The people, the protesters who are out there every day, the future generations, the kids that I talk to on a regular basis. I want to do this and get this right for future generations. So yeah.
Well, I think that's well said. And I do think you mentioned this earlier, that the future generations, I think one thing that's come out of this, I feel much better about where we're going, given the folks that are behind you and I in age, and the activism they've showed, the desire to change, the engagement, and the passion they have for wanting to create a more just and equal society. So I feel good about that. I hope that is the case, and I hope that's where we see things. Now, anything else you want to say before we close things out? It's been great chatting with you for a little bit. Anything else you want to touch on?
I know, just everyone use your voice to the best that you can, and continue the work.
Great stuff. Thank you, Lonita. I appreciate it. I'm glad I got to be part of it. And yes, everybody, do your work, do your part. Every little bit helps. And politics, you mentioned politics a lot. All politics is local. So get involved locally, and we can change things nationally.
Lonita and Dallin, thank you both for taking the time to speak with us and for hosting an outstanding conversation on the call to activism. And once again, thank you to our attendees for joining us tonight. Don't forget to tune into our final webinar of the 2021 ACC Spring Unity Week, The State of College Athletics, with Dr. Carla Williams and Heather Like tomorrow at 7 p.m. Have a great night, everyone.